On January 29th, 1945, at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, First Sergeant Leonard Funk walked around a farmhouse corner in Holtzheim, Belgium, and stopped cold. 90 German soldiers stood 15 feet away, half of them already armed and pointing rifles directly at his chest. 4 American guards knelt in the snow with their hands behind their heads, prisoners in the village they had just captured hours earlier. A German officer stepped forward and shoved the cold steel barrel of an MP-40 submachine gun directly into Funk's stomach, screaming surrender commands in broken English. Leonard Funk was 5'5" and weighed 140 pounds. He had been labeled clerk material by army recruiters who thought he was too small for combat. The German officer towering over him probably thought the same thing. What neither the recruiters nor the German officer understood was that Leonard Funk had spent the last 8 months being systematically transformed by the most brutal campaigns of World War II. And in the next 60 seconds, this small man from a Pennsylvania steel town would do something so violently impossible that it would earn him the Medal of Honor and President Truman's personal whisper, "I would rather have this medal than be president." But before we understand that moment, we need to go back to where it all started, because Leonard Funk's story isn't about one lucky day in the snow. It's about what happens when an ordinary man is pushed through hell 3 times over and comes out the other side as something else entirely. If you're watching from anywhere in the world right now, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Stories like Leonard Funk's deserve to be known, and your likes and comments help us bring these untold hero stories to more people who need to hear them. Now, let's go back to where Leonard's journey really began. Braddock, Pennsylvania in 1940 was a town built by giants for giants. The blast furnaces of Edgar Thomson Steel Works towered 7 stories high, belching smoke and soot into the air 24 hours a day. The men who worked those furnaces were titans, broad-shouldered immigrants and their sons who could lift 100-pound ingots like they were sacks of flour. In a town where physical size determined your worth and your paycheck, Leonard Funk Jr. was invisible. At 5'5" and barely 140 pounds soaking wet, Funk moved through Braddock like a ghost. He wasn't weak. He worked the same 12-hour shifts as everyone else, but in a culture where respect came from how much steel you could move and how many beers you could drink, being small meant being secondary. Foremen looked past him when assigning the premium jobs. Women at the church socials smiled politely and danced with taller men. Even his own father, a mill worker who stood 6 feet tall, seemed perpetually disappointed that his son hadn't inherited his frame. But Leonard Funk had learned something that the giants around him never had to learn. When you're small, you don't get second chances. You don't get the benefit of the doubt. You have to be twice as good, twice as determined, and you have to prove it every single day. It wasn't insecurity that drove him, it was cold mathematical reality. In a world built for big men, small men either quit or they learned to outlast everyone else through pure, stubborn will. Most men in his position would have accepted their lot, taken a safe job, married a local girl, and spent 40 years in the shadow of the furnaces. Leonard Funk made a different choice. On a cold morning in November 1942, he walked into the Army recruiting station in Pittsburgh and told the sergeant he wanted to enlist. The sergeant looked him up and down, noted his height and weight, and stamped his file with 2 words, "clerk duty." Funk looked at those words for a long moment, then looked back at the sergeant and said something that would define the rest of his life. "I'm volunteering for the paratroopers." The sergeant actually laughed. The paratroopers were the most physically demanding, most dangerous unit in the entire United States Army. They had a 30% washout rate in training alone. Men died learning how to jump. But Funk wasn't asking for permission, he was stating a fact. He was going to be a paratrooper, and nothing the sergeant said was going to change his mind. The sergeant stopped laughing and stamped the paperwork. He probably figured the kid would wash out in a week. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. Fort Benning, Georgia, in the summer of 1943, was designed to break men. The Army needed paratroopers who could survive behind enemy lines, and the only way to find them was to push recruits past their breaking point and see who refused to quit. The training was brutal by design. 5-mile runs in full gear before breakfast, obstacle courses that left men vomiting in the Georgia heat, push-ups until your arms gave out, then more push-ups, and then there were the jumps, leaping from towers and aircraft with nothing but a parachute and the hope that it would open. Leonard Funk arrived at Fort Benning with 200 other volunteers. Most of them were bigger, stronger, and looked like they'd been born for this. The instructors took one look at Funk and assigned him a bunk in the back, probably figuring he'd be gone within days. In the first week alone, 30 men quit. Big men, strong men, men who looked like they could wrestle bears but couldn't handle the relentless grind of airborne training. Funk never quit. When his legs screamed during the runs, he kept running. When his shoulders burned during the pack marches, he kept marching. He watched men twice his size collapse from exhaustion and get carted away on stretchers while he stayed on his feet. It wasn't that the training was easy for him. It destroyed him the same way it destroyed everyone else. The difference was that Funk had spent his entire life being underestimated, and he'd learned that the only response was to simply refuse to break. By the end of 12 weeks, only 83 men remained from the original 200. Leonard Funk stood among them, 5'5" and 140 pounds, when the instructor pinned the silver jump wings to his chest. He didn't smile or celebrate. He just nodded once and thought to himself, endurance beats size every single time. On June 6, 1944, at 1:30 in the morning, Leonard Funk jumped out of a C-47 transport aircraft into the black sky over Normandy, France. The D-Day invasion was supposed to be precise and coordinated, but the reality was chaos. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the night. Planes scattered in every direction, and paratroopers were dropped miles from their intended zones. Funk's parachute deployed correctly, but he came down hard in a hedgerow-lined field, landing at an angle that sent his left ankle snapping sideways with a sound like breaking kindling. The pain was instant and blinding. He lay in the dark French grass, gasping, knowing that his war should have ended right there. The smart move was to stay put, wait for medics, and accept that he'd done his part just by making the jump. But lying there in the darkness, listening to distant gunfire and the screams of wounded men, Funk made a calculation. If he stayed here, he was useless. If he moved, he might die from the pain or get shot by a German patrol, but at least he'd be moving towards something. He stood up. The ankle refused to bear weight, so he fashioned a splint from parachute cords and a tree branch, then started moving through the hedgerows. Within the first hour, he found 3 lost paratroopers from different units, all of them disoriented and terrified. By dawn, he'd gathered 18 men, none of them from his company, all of them looking to him for direction, because he was the only one who knew what he was doing. For the next 10 days, Funk led those 18 men on a 40-mile march through German-occupied territory to reach Utah Beach. They moved at night, navigating by the stars and a compass Funk had salvaged from a dead officer. The ankle was a constant source of agony, every step sending fire up his leg, but Funk learned to treat it as background noise, something happening to his body but not to his mission. They had close calls with German patrols, twice hiding in ditches while enemy soldiers passed within feet of them. One night, they walked past a farmhouse where SS troops were interrogating a French family, and Funk had to physically hold his hand over a young private's mouth to keep him from crying out. When they finally stumbled onto Utah Beach on June 16th, filthy and exhausted, a captain informed Funk he was being recommended for the Silver Star. A medic examined his ankle, now swollen to twice its normal size and turning purple-black, and asked the question that would define Leonard Funk's entire war. "Sergeant, how the hell are you even walking on this thing?" Funk looked down at the ruined ankle, then back at the medic, and said something he'd never forget. "Didn't seem like I had a choice."
The responsibility should have crushed him. Instead, it clarified everything. During those 10 days in Normandy, Funk had been fighting for his own survival, dragging himself forward because quitting meant dying. But now, sitting in that tent with the roster in his hands, he understood that his survival didn't matter anymore. What mattered was getting these men through the war alive, and that required a different kind of thinking entirely. Funk developed a simple philosophy that became his guiding principle for everything that followed. Take care of your men, and they'll take care of the mission. It meant checking their equipment before every jump, making sure they had dry socks in the winter, listening when they needed to talk, and pushing them harder in training than the enemy would push them in combat. It meant earning their trust, not through speeches or bravado, but through consistent action. And it meant accepting that some of them wouldn't make it home, no matter how well he led them. The psychological shift was complete. Leonard Funk stopped thinking about himself as a soldier trying to survive and started thinking about himself as a leader responsible for other men's lives. When the orders came down for Operation Market Garden in September, Funk wasn't worried about his own safety. He was worried about the 73 names on his roster and how many of them would still be alive when it was over. Operation Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944, with the ambitious goal of seizing bridges across the Netherlands and opening a path into Germany. The 508th dropped into the Dutch countryside near the town of Volkshill, and within hours, Funk's company was taking fire from German 20mm anti-aircraft guns that were shredding Allied transport planes as they tried to drop supplies. The guns had to be silenced, and Funk volunteered as patrol for the job. Intelligence reported 7 Germans manning the battery, dug in behind earthworks about half a mile from the American position. Funk took 12 men and moved out just after dawn, using hedgerows and drainage ditches for cover. They could hear the guns hammering away, the distinctive thump, thump, thump of 20mm rounds punching through Allied aluminum. Every burst meant another plane damaged, another crew killed, another supply drop that wouldn't reach the troops who needed it. When they reached the edge of the tree line overlooking the gun position, Funk raised his binoculars and felt his stomach drop. There weren't 7 Germans, there were at least 50, maybe more, scattered around 3 separate gun emplacements with supporting infantry positions. The smart tactical move was obvious: pull back, report the actual enemy strength, and wait for artillery or air support. Funk looked at his 12 men, then back at the guns that were still firing at Allied aircraft, and made a different calculation entirely. Hesitation kills. The lesson crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. If they retreated, the guns would keep firing for hours, maybe days, until someone else got orders to take them out. More planes would fall, more men would die, and his patrol would have accomplished nothing except confirming that the enemy was too strong to engage. Leonard Funk had spent his entire life being told he was too small to matter, and he'd proven that assessment wrong every single time by refusing to accept it as truth. He turned to his men and gave the order in a voice that left no room for argument. They were charging the position, right now, before the Germans knew they were there. The attack was pure, controlled violence. Funk led from the front, his Thompson submachine gun bucking against his shoulder as he sprinted across open ground toward the nearest gun emplacement. The Germans, shocked by the sudden assault, scrambled for their weapons. Funk cut down the first three before they could raise their rifles, then threw a grenade into the gun pit and kept moving. His men followed his lead, spreading out and hitting the enemy positions with everything they had. The firefight lasted 7 minutes, 7 minutes of screaming, explosions, and the metallic stutter of automatic weapons fire. Funk moved through it like he was born for it, dropping targets with short, controlled bursts, reloading without thinking, advancing when every instinct said to take cover. The Germans broke first. Some tried to surrender. Others ran. By the time the shooting stopped, all 3 gun positions were silent, and Funk's patrol controlled the field. 2 of his men were wounded, none were dead. The enemy had lost 23 killed and 17 captured. The remaining Germans had fled into the woods. Private Eddie Brennan, blood still pumping with adrenaline, found Funk checking the captured weapons and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Sarge, did you know there were 50 of them?" Funk didn't look up from the German rifle he was inspecting. "Would it changed anything if I did?" The answer was no, and they all knew it. Leonard Funk had just learned the most dangerous lesson of his life. Violence applied with absolute commitment and zero hesitation could overcome any numerical disadvantage. The odds didn't matter if you refused to accept them as real. 3 weeks later, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. But the real prize wasn't the medal. It was the certainty that impossible odds were just numbers on paper, and numbers could be changed if you hit them hard enough and fast enough. That lesson would save his life in Belgium 4 months later.
The Ardennes forest in December 1944 was a frozen hell that killed men as efficiently as German bullets. The snow came down in sheets, turning foxholes into ice graves where soldiers huddled for warmth that never came. Supply lines couldn't keep up with the German advance, which meant Company C went days without hot food, without ammunition resupply, without the winter gear they desperately needed. Men lost toes to frostbite. Others simply stopped shivering in the night and never woke up. The cold was an enemy that didn't negotiate or retreat. But the cold was nothing compared to what came next. On December 17th, word spread through the American lines like wildfire. Near the town of Malmedy, a Waffen SS unit had captured 84 American prisoners during the initial German breakthrough. The Americans had surrendered properly, hands raised, weapons down, following every rule of the Geneva Convention. The SS lined them up in a snow-covered field and machine-gunned them all. 84 men executed while kneeling in the snow, their hands still raised in surrender, even as the bullets tore through them. The news hit Company C like a physical blow. These weren't rumors or propaganda. The massacre had been confirmed by survivors who'd played dead under the bodies of their friends. The SS had walked through the pile afterward, shooting anyone who moved, anyone who groaned, anyone who showed signs of life. The rules of civilized warfare, the agreements that said surrendering soldiers would be treated as prisoners rather than targets, had been revealed as worthless paper. Funk sat in his foxhole that night, methodically cleaning his Thompson submachine gun with numb fingers. The other men could see him working in the dim light, breaking down the weapon, checking every part, reassembling it with practiced efficiency. Nobody spoke, but they all understood what he was doing. He was preparing for a war with no rules, a war where surrender meant execution, and the only options were victory or death. He never made a speech about it, never gathered the men and told them what the new reality meant.
But when he finished cleaning the Thompson and loaded a fresh magazine, he whispered 2 words to himself that everyone within earshot heard clearly in the frozen silence. Never again. It wasn't bravado or empty tough talk. It was simple survival mathematics. If the enemy executes prisoners, then surrendering becomes suicide. The only rational choice is to fight until you win, or until you're physically incapable of fighting anymore. Leonard Funk had just made a vow that would define every decision he made for the rest of the war. He would never surrender, never quit, and never allow his men to be lined up in a field with their hands raised. When the German officer shoved that MP-40 into his stomach 5 weeks later in Holtzheim, Funk had already decided how that confrontation would end.
By mid-January 1945, Company C existed more on paper than in reality. The Battle of the Bulge had chewed through the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment like a meat grinder, leaving Funk with barely 30 combat-effective soldiers from a unit that was supposed to field over 100. The rest were dead, wounded, or so broken by frostbite and exhaustion that they couldn't hold a rifle steady. High Command's solution was simple and brutal. Pull men from rear echelon positions and turn them into infantry. Funk found himself standing in a bombed-out barn outside Bastogne, looking at 40 men who'd enlisted specifically to avoid this moment. There were cooks who'd spent the war making stew in field kitchens, mechanics who knew more about truck engines than rifle mechanisms, supply clerks who'd been processing paperwork while other men did the dyeing. They stood in rough formation, scared and trying not to show it, waiting for the legendary first sergeant to tell them they weren't cut out for combat. Instead, Funk saw himself. He saw the 5'5" kid from Braddock who'd been stamped clerk duty by a recruiting sergeant who couldn't see past his size. He saw men who'd been dismissed and underestimated their entire lives, and he knew exactly what they needed to hear. He spent 3 days training them in that barn. The lessons were brutal but patient. How to clear a room without dying, how to move under fire, how to load and reload a rifle until your frozen fingers could do it in pitch darkness. He never mocked them for being afraid or inexperienced. He just taught them the same truth he'd learned at Fort Benning and proven in Normandy, Holland, and the Ardennes. "You don't have to be big," he told them on the 3rd morning, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. "You don't have to be brave. You just have to refuse to quit when everything in you is screaming to stop. That's the only difference between men who make it and men who don't." They believed him because he was living proof that it worked. On January 28th, the orders came down. Company C would take the village of Holtzheim, a small Belgian town that intelligence reported as lightly defended, probably just a rear guard unit. Funk gathered his makeshift platoon of former clerks and cooks and told them what they needed to hear. "We'll walk in, secure it, and be drinking coffee by dinner." 24 hours later, he'd be facing 90 Germans with a gun pressed against his stomach, and every lesson he'd taught these men would be put to the ultimate test.
January 29, 1945, at 2:47 in the afternoon, Leonard Funk walked around the corner of a stone farmhouse in Holtzheim and stepped into the impossible. 90 German soldiers filled the farmhouse yard, half of them already armed with rifles they'd just reclaimed from a captured weapons pile. 4 American guards knelt in the snow with their hands behind their heads, prisoners in the village they'd secured just hours earlier. A German counterattack had freed these prisoners, and now they were rearming themselves for a push against the thinly defended American positions. A German officer, tall and confident, stepped forward and shoved the barrel of an MP-40 submachine gun directly into Funk's stomach. He barked commands in broken English, the words hardly mattering because the meaning was clear. Surrender, hands up, join your men kneeling in the snow. Funk's mind processed the situation with mechanical precision. Running meant the 4 guards would be executed immediately. Stalling meant more Germans might arrive and turn 90-1 odds into something even worse. And surrendering, after Malmedy, after the vow he'd made in that frozen foxhole, was simply not an option that existed in his reality anymore. There was only one choice left, and it was the same choice he'd made in Holland when facing 50 Germans instead of 7. He started laughing. It wasn't hysteria, it was a calculated gamble based on 3 seconds of human confusion. The German officer's face twisted in uncertainty, his grip on the MP40 loosening slightly as he tried to understand if the small American had lost his mind or was mocking him. The other Germans hesitated, looking at each other, unsure how to respond to laughter when they'd expected fear. In those 3 seconds of hesitation, Funk unslung his Thompson submachine gun in one smooth motion and opened fire. The German officer died first, 3 rounds punching through his chest before his brain could send the signal to pull his own trigger. Funk pivoted and emptied the rest of his magazine into the crowded yard, dropping Germans who were still fumbling to raise rifles they'd just picked up. The farmhouse yard exploded into chaos, men screaming, bodies falling, the sharp chemical smell of cordite mixing with the clean scent of snow. The 4 American guards, freed from their shock by the sound of gunfire, threw themselves at the nearest Germans and started fighting with fists and captured weapons. Other American soldiers from inside the farmhouse heard the shooting and came running. What had been a one-sided capture became a desperate close-quarters battle. Funk reloaded without thinking, muscle memory taking over while his conscious mind stayed perfectly calm. The Thompson bucked against his shoulder as he fired controlled bursts into targets that presented themselves. A German raising a rifle, another pulling the pin on a grenade, a third trying to organize a defensive position. Each target fell before they could complete their action. 60 seconds after the laughter started, 21 Germans lay dead in the snow, and the rest were throwing down their weapons, hands raised, screaming surrender in German and broken English. The mathematics had shifted. The hunter had become the prey, and they wanted no part of whatever demon was standing in their farmhouse yard, with steam rising from his gun barrel. Funk stood in the center of it all, breathing steady, his Thompson still raised and ready. The surrendering Germans stared at him like he was something supernatural, something that shouldn't exist. One of the freed American guards, his face pale with shock and adrenaline, whispered what they were all thinking. "Jesus Christ, Sarge, you laughed at them." Funk didn't respond. He just kept his weapon trained on the prisoners and waited for backup to arrive. In his mind, there was nothing supernatural about what had just happened. It was simply the inevitable result of 8 months of systematic forging. Normandy had taught him endurance. Holland had taught him aggression. The Ardennes had taught him that surrender was death. And Holtzheim had proven that when you combine all 3 lessons and refuse to accept impossible odds as real, you become something the enemy can't predict or counter. The clerk from Braddock had become the most dangerous man in Belgium, and he'd done it by simply refusing to quit when any rational person would have given up.
On June 18, 1945, Leonard Funk stood in the White House Rose Garden wearing his dress uniform and trying not to look as uncomfortable as he felt. President Harry Truman approached with the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, and draped the blue ribbon around Funk's neck. Then Truman leaned in close and whispered something that nobody else in the garden could hear. "I would rather have this medal than be president." Funk nodded once and said nothing. What was there to say? The President of the United States had just told him that killing 21 men in 60 seconds was worth more than leading the free world, and Funk couldn't decide if that was the highest compliment he'd ever received or the saddest thing anyone had ever said to him. 3 months later, he was back in Pennsylvania. The war was over, the parades were done, the newspapers had moved on to other stories.
Leonard Funk took a job at the Veterans Administration in Pittsburgh, processing disability claims and helping broken men navigate the bureaucracy of a grateful nation that didn't quite know what to do with them. He sat at the same desk for 27 years, filing paperwork, answering phones, and never once mentioning the medal that sat in a drawer at home. When veterans recognized his name and asked about Holtzheim, he changed the subject. When reporters called asking for interviews, he politely declined. When the VFW Hall invited him to speak at their annual dinner, he sent his regrets. The man who had laughed at 90 Germans and lived to tell about it had no interest in telling about it. There was no Hollywood trauma, no visible scars beyond the limp from his Normandy ankle, but there was something else, something quieter and more profound. Leonard Funk had been forged into a weapon by the most brutal campaigns of World War II, and then he'd been asked to return to being an ordinary man. He helped other veterans process their trauma every single day, filling out forms that would get them medical care and housing and the support they needed. But he never processed his own. The knowledge of what he was capable of, what he had done and could do again if necessary, never left him. On August 20th, 1973, Leonard Funk died at age 56. Hundreds attended his funeral, including senators and generals who flew in from Washington to pay their respects. But the eulogy that mattered most came from a gray-haired man in the back who'd been a Company C cook, one of the clerks Funk had trained in that frozen barn outside Bastogne. He taught me that it doesn't matter how small you are or where you come from. What matters is what you do when everything's on the line. Sarge never quit. Not once, not ever. The Medal of Honor sits in a glass case at the 82nd Airborne Museum today, next to a small placard